is the Arctic, an icy, cold, beautiful wilderness that is almost completely devoid of people, but crucial for the human race. Our energy reserves elsewhere on the planet are in the process of being depleted, but the Arctic still contains vast quantities of untapped oil and gas. The potential for conflict over these resources has resulted in a substantial increase in military activities in the Arctic during the last few years. Will we manage to resolve any future energy crises without resorting to the use of military force?
Forward stop engine! Finish.
Modern civilization is completely dependent on oil, which, more than any other natural resources, defines our current era. The problem is that there will soon no longer be any oil left on Earth. Most of the world's large oil fields have now reached peak oil. This has resulted in oil exploration activities taking place in increasingly more remote places. There is just one source of oil that is still more or less intact. The Arctic, a sea and land massif covering 6% of the Earth's surface. Global warming and new technology are now paving the way for new transport routes and creating access to these resources. We will all be affected by the battle for these resources. For several years, there's been little military activity in the Arctic, but now all the countries in the area are starting to increase their military activity dramatically. Here, on the island of Andøya, is one of the air bases that supports military operations in the Arctic. Someone who is witness to military developments in the Arctic on a daily basis is Johan Hetta, a pilot with 333 Squadron.
333-skvadronen sin hovedoppgave å drive overvåking og følge med I norske interesseområder, særlig da nordpå. Vi et instrument for det militære og for staten for å skaffe informasjon og til enhver tid ha et riktig bilde av det som måtte foregå I våre interesseområder.
From their base on Andøya, intelligence-gathering aircraft belonging to the squadron fly to some of the most inhospitable areas in the Arctic. However, Johan Hetta is not unfamiliar with Arctic territory.
Jeg vokste opp I en veldig liten samebygd hvor det bare bodde 350 mennesker. Midt på tundraen på Finnmarksvidda. Far min han har hatt helt siden jeg var liten en Cessna 206 på flottører. Da ble jeg bitt. Med meg så var det aldri sånn at jeg skulle bli politimann, og så skulle jeg bli brandmann, og så skulle jeg bli pilot, og så politimann igjen, eller noe sånt. Jeg har alltid vært, skal alltid bli pilot da. Så det har aldri vært noe skifte sånn sett. Det utrolig gøy å fly fremdeles, det er det jo. Og helt til å begynne med så var det jo bare det å komme seg opp var jo ufattelig morsomt. Og det slår fremdeles en dag på kontoret når som helst.
The Orion aircraft is setting course for the Barents Sea in order to carry out a military mission that many people thought would be unnecessary once the Cold War had come to an end. When the Berlin Wall fell, most people thought that the possibility of war breaking out in Europe was something that we'd put behind us. But the Cold War never really came to an end in the Arctic, where the superpowers have been playing intelligence games all along, testing out each other's first strike capabilities. This game is taking place around the polar ice cap, both above and below sea level. This area also contains vast fisheries and petroleum resources that will become even more important in the future, and these nations are using military power to enforce their rights.
Arctic states are looking at a change from global warming. They're seeing where, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, potentially a quarter of the world's oil and gas resources may be under the Arctic cap. And with that comes, as you know, appropriately, a great race, a great game to see who can have access to those resources first.
Both throughout history and in more recent times, the Arctic has had an important military role, even in respect of conflicts taking place on the other side of the world. The Svalsat satellite station is located just outside Longyearbyen on Svalbard. It's eminently suitable for downloading satellite data because the distance between the Earth's satellites and the Earth is shorter here than anywhere else in the world. On the 24th of March 2003, when the US armed forces were heading towards Baghdad, they were stopped by a heavy sandstorm. There were two satellites circling high up in the Earth's upper atmosphere that were able to see right through the sandstorm. In order for these satellites to send their information to the Americans, they were completely dependent on being able to download their observations to a station in the Arctic. And this is where they were sent. The attack on Baghdad was able to proceed. War strategists have been totally dependent on the Arctic ever since the Second World War, because stations based in the Arctic have been able to provide forecasts about the weather in Europe 72 hours in advance. The Second World War was an entirely new type of war during which the Air Force played a crucial role. Precise weather forecasts were essential for the planning of air operations. Both the Germans and the Allies set up secret weather stations in the most inhospitable and inaccessible places they could find. One of these stations, Houdingen, was located on the northern coast of the island of Nord-Østlandet on Svalbard. It was so inaccessible and remote that it didn't surrender to the Allies until the 4th of September 1945. The Iron Curtain came down almost immediately after the surrender of the soldiers at Houdingen. During the course of just a couple of years, the fronts between the Western powers and Stalin's Soviet Union froze over, especially the Arctic.
The Arctic really was a key area in the Cold War, and it could have become dreadfully chaotic if the war had heated up. During the Cold War, the Arctic, of course, is where conflicting missiles and aircraft would have flown. And therefore, the whole northern rim of Canada was lined with radar stations looking for Russian aircraft. Very big radars were in Scotland and Thule, Greenland, looking for incoming. And I'm sure the Soviets had the same sort of arrangements on the North Shore, that if the balloon had gone up, the Arctic would have been the area over which aircraft would have flown.
One of the many inventions of the Cold War was the Orion intelligence-gathering aircraft, which is still involved in active service. This aircraft is equipped with top-secret listening equipment and is highly efficient at gathering information.
flymaskinen bare flyr gjennom luftrommet og tar inn all den informasjonen som blir båret gjennom radiobølger. Vi har radar ombord og andre sensorer som muliggjør å ha et veldig god oversikt over store områder rundt oss. I tillegg til at vi da kan fly veldig langt og forholdsvis fort, i hvert fall i forhold til en båt. På et oppdrag så dekker vi det Kystvakta ville brukt 3 uker på.
One of the main tasks is to obtain as much intelligence as possible about increasing Russian activities in the area.
Vi har sett en økning i russisk militær aktivitet generelt. De har vært nede på grunn av dårlig økonomi og begynner å komme nå opp på et normalt nivå. Det har vært unaturlig lite aktivitet de siste 10 årene. Det er jo greit å vite hva naboen gjør, og da dermed forebygge eventuelle konflikter, og at man hele tiden har åpenhet om det man driver med, sånn at man forstår hverandre og ikke har misforståelser.
This increase in military activities could cause suspicion to arise between the countries in the area. In March 2009, Norway organized a major international military exercise, Cold Response. During the Cold War, this was a common event. However, during the last 15 years, the Arctic has fallen increasingly into the shadow of the war on terror. NATO has been focusing elsewhere. For a small country like Norway, which has Russia as its closest neighbour, it's essential to get your allies to become interested in the northern areas again. The Norwegian authorities therefore invited many nations to participate in this exercise.
Det vi prøver å få til nå en økende NATO-overbygning over de øvelsene som foregår. Altså både få flere land inn, få mer profil på dem, men også styrke koblingen til NATOs hovedkvarterer i Europa. Det var jo på mange måter veldig positivt at man i løpet av tidlig 90-tall nedgraderte bekymringene for konflikt i Europa. Det var jo uttrykk for en veldig optimistisk tid, men utviklingen gikk nesten litt vel langt i retning av å fullstendig definere bort det klassiske territoriet til fordel for operasjoner utenfor det klassiske territoriet.
The scenario for exercise Cold Response was an imaginary conflict between 2 states about energy resources. After having been attacked by a larger enemy, the smaller country hits back with the help of its allies. This exercise scenario was not well received by the Russian authorities, who called the exercise a provocation.
Det var noen reaksjoner fra russisk hold på Cold Response. De tar jeg egentlig med ganske stor ro. Vi har en forsvarsallianse, vi ikke flaue over det, vi øver på forsvar. Men det altså en feillesning av det scenariet, at det var et scenarie som sådan involverte Russland i en ressurskonflikt. Dette var et generisk scenario som vi hadde laget for å lage en reell øvelsesbakgrunn som var mest mulig realistisk, men som kunne vært plassert mange forskjellige steder i verden.
The Russians are reacting suspiciously to Western military activities in the Arctic. The explanation for this is largely based on past events.
President Putin in 2005 said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. I think that it's not only President Putin who thinks like this, but the society has also experienced the changes after the Cold War as a great failure. I think that the steps taken by the United States and NATO, other Western European countries and organizations have overlooked how deep the feeling of failure and humiliation can actually be in Russia.
Russia has increased its military activities in the Arctic. This illustration shows sorties undertaken by Russian military aircraft off the Norwegian coast in 2005. 2 years later, these activities had increased dramatically.
The increased military activity, Russia's focus on military power, they have also a domestic dimension. The Russian public react very positively to this kind of activities, which restore the picture of Russia as a great power again.
Russia's revenue from its increasing exports of petroleum and other raw materials has enabled the country to recover after the Soviet Union collapsed at the beginning of the 1990s when it lost the Cold War. Another major nation emerged victorious from this conflict. Thomas Reed was President Reagan's national security advisor at the beginning of the 1980s.
The Cold War really was a conflict between two views as the role of man, government, perhaps supreme beings. It was a free society believing in individual freedoms versus a society that the individual owes his allegiance to the state and exists for the existence of the state. That led to conflicts and could have led to very serious conflicts with possible World War III. It did not, because careful people were involved.
The Cold War resulted in an unprecedented increase in military activities in the Arctic.
This is the story of Camp Century, the city under ice.
Here on Greenland, the USA built what was one of the Cold War's most secret projects, a launch pad for nuclear missiles beneath the ice. A maze of tunnels designed to be several hundred kilometers long and covering an area the size of Greece.
As part of man's continuing efforts to master the secrets of survival in the Arctic, the United States Army has established an unprecedented nuclear-powered Arctic Research Center.
Around 60 trains, each with 10 nuclear missiles ready to be launched, would travel along railway lines in the tunnels. This huge facility was to be powered by nuclear reactors which would also be placed beneath the ice. The secret base was operational between 1959 and 1966. It proved that it was possible for a large number of people to live under such extreme conditions and operate advanced military equipment.
We had to show that we could operate in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. This forced the Soviets to keep a number of forces tied down to combat that particular threat. If we hadn't, their forces would have been free to go out into the Atlantic and raise havoc with our sea lines of communication.
At the beginning of the 1980s, the Soviet Navy had modernized the vessels in its northern fleet, and they'd also developed nuclear submarines that were able to hide beneath the polar ice cap. Admiral Ace Lyons decided to counter these developments with a new, aggressive American naval strategy in the Arctic.
We were not going to cede control of either the North Atlantic or the Arctic to the Soviets. The fact that we were able to demonstrate that we could strike the Soviet homeland from the North Atlantic, from the Arctic, tied down a number of their forces, and which to me was a key element in raising the level of deterrence, which is what we were really all about. We were able to do that basically without firing a shot.
All stations TA, we have a possible submarine contact. Bearing 294, 3,500 yards ahead. You're bogey 8015, take with missiles, cover with guns.
Soviet submarines were shadowed constantly from the time they left their bases on the Kola Peninsula, and they could be sunk the very minute they opened their nuclear missile launch hatches. Soviet submarine commander Boris Kolyada was a witness to the new American strategy.
Меня возмущало нахождение американских подводных лодок в Баренцевом море. Не просто в Баренцевом море, а конкретно в наших территориальных водах, у наших территориальных вод на выходах из баз. Они встречали подводные лодки, надводные корабли, то есть занимались такой активной разведывательной деятельностью, причем активно наглой разведывательной деятельностью. Ну, скажу так, как это рассчитывать, когда ты выходишь из квартиры на лестницу, а там группа хулиганов уже ждет тебя и не дает тебе даже дойти до магазина, допустим, да? Это так вот, шутя, а фактически это очень напряженно сказывалось на службе офицеров, на службе военно-морского флота.
Ubåtjakt jo det som Orion opprinnelig ble designet for, og det fremdeles en av hovedoppgavene våre. Forskjellen fra det som foregikk under den kalde krigen og det som vi gjør nå jo at før var det jo veldig mye mer militært fokus enn det nå. Så vi har fremdeles, selvfølgelig har vi militært fokus, vi en militær avdeling, men vi har også veldig mye mer ressursforvaltning og en del miljøaspekter da, som overhodet ikke stod i oppdragsporteføljen vår før da. Når det gjelder fiskeressursene nordpå, så blir jo de sendt over hele verden, og det enorme summer det snakk om da. Det derfor det så attraktivt å jukse.
Fish in the Arctic is a renewable resource which yields billions of dollars each year. Here in Reitan, outside Bodø, is the control center which is able to see all movements in the Arctic. In practice, it's only the armed forces who are responsible for the enforcement of rights and keeping an eye on things in the Arctic. Obviously, one of the reasons for this is because they have the necessary expertise and equipment. But the use of military forces and the huge increase in military activities that's currently taking place is also an expression of the fact that there are vast assets to be guarded.
Ta fiskeriene. Det jo praktisk talt et svømmende oljefond. Dette en strategisk ressurs av stor betydning for Norge, men også av stor betydning for andre land. Det svært viktig å ha god kontroll med fiskeriene, slik at ressursuttaket bærekraftig, og at den økonomien som dette representerer også blir ivaretatt på en skikkelig måte. Det svært viktig arbeid.
The Norwegian and Russian coast guards have also cooperated on the prevention of illegal fishing in the Barents Sea. In 2006, the Russian authorities asked for assistance in arresting a pirate ship, the Castor, which was fishing illegally in the Norwegian protection zone.
Den førte falsk flagg. Den hadde flere falske registreringsnumre ombord, og vi identifiserte at fartøyet hevdet å være registrert i hvert fall 3 forskjellige stater. Og Castor skiftet da identitet, litt avhengig av I hvilke zoner og hvilke områder den opererte.
Her ser vi at han tar flekker av malingen den enda ikke tør etter 6-7 timer ombord.
The captain of the Castor was unwilling to allow the Coast Guard to go on board.
Engine. No more discussion now. For what stop engine? Finish. Calm Maribor. Please stop. Please stop engine.
Andre siden, på turbosiden.
Det ble tatt kontroll over fartøyet, og fartøyet ble ført tilbake igjen til russisk økonomisk zone og overrakt til russiske myndigheter. Det har vært flere andre slike saker, men budskapet egentlig at I Barentshavet så gjennomføres det en rekke operasjoner mot aktører som bedriver illegal aktivitet.
Cooperation between Norway and Russia over the management of fisheries in the Arctic has been successful for several years now. But will it be as easy to cooperate over another valuable resource in the Arctic? A resource which, unlike fish, is not renewable. In 2008, two major crises occurred in Russia's neighboring territories, both of which had an impact on our view of the security situation in the Arctic. The first crisis occurred on the 8th of August 2008 when Russian tanks invaded Georgia. The second crisis, which had a direct impact on Europe, occurred later on during the same year. This time, it was the Russians exerting their power in the energy field. In connection with a conflict with Ukraine, Russia shut down the gas pipeline running via Ukraine to Europe. These pipelines were closed for several weeks. When they were eventually reopened, Western Europe's energy reserves were almost empty. Both the invasion of Georgia and the gas crisis were strong wake-up calls for the rest of the world, which had now witnessed Russia's will to exert power in its neighboring areas.
I have long been worried about Europe's potential dependence on Russian natural gas, and like a lot of people, I was relatively relaxed about this from 1989 through the mid-90s because I thought, you know, buying gas from Russia might not be that different than buying it from Canada or Norway or whatever, just a market. But now that Putin and Medvedev are so committed to using energy as an instrument of national power in order to keep Ukraine from joining NATO, you shut off their gas, for example. That situation is, I think, extremely risky.
Geopolitical issues have always been important in the oil industry. There are a lot of concern about the security of supply from various countries where there are some political or security issues. But if we have a long-term perspective of that, I think we need to be optimistic. Even if there are political changes in these countries will need to develop their own resources because they are so important for their developments.
Looking to the map of the I-North, what place Russia as in the map of I-North? How can you govern the I-North without Russia? Or you confront Russia, or you go on with Russia. It is important for the alliance to develop a constructive relationship with Russia, and even more important so in the Arctic, in the High North, where Russia is by far a dominant player under any respect.
But gas assets are a two-edged sword for Russia. They're dependent on selling gas to Europe in order to fund their military rearmament. The Soviet Union was paradoxically in the same situation during the Cold War, and this made them vulnerable. In June 1982, there was an explosion in a gas pipeline transporting Soviet gas from the Siberian oil fields to major customers in Western Europe. This explosion had a huge detrimental impact on the country's economy and contributed towards the collapse of the Soviet Union. The official explanation for the explosion was poor workmanship. It would take more than 20 years before the truth was revealed.
An interesting episode in the Cold War was the discovery of the Soviet penetration of the U.S. technology industries and their intent to steal that technology. It came to a head in 1981 when President Mitterrand of France met with President Reagan at a summit meeting in Montreal, took him aside and said, "We have acquired an agent working within the Soviet technology department of KGB, and we have learned that they are stealing technology and targeting others. And would you be interested?" To which, of course, President Reagan said yes. The Farewell Files was the code name for this agent in Moscow. It was learned what the Soviets were going to steal, and instead of stopping it, the American technological industries were recruited to instead ship bogus stuff. The Soviets had natural gas in Siberia. They wanted to sell it in Germany. They were building a pipeline. They needed computers to run this pipeline. They could buy the mainframe computers, but the software they did not have, and they finally acquired illegally through conduits in Canada, except due to the Farewell lead, we knew who that was. And so when the software was sent to the Soviets via this Canadian cutout, it had what's known as a Trojan horse.
The software had been manipulated by the CIA so that it would cause the gas pipeline to explode at a given time.
I believe the intent was to simply have the pipeline spring 1,000 leaks all over, but it appears that what really happened was the pipeline burst in the middle of Siberia, produced an explosion that was visible from space, produced a lot of confusion to U.S. intelligence analysts, and in fact none of us, like even myself, who was in the White House at the time, learned about this until the Cold War is over and we started sorting through the historical files.
Når vi skal ut på et operativt tokt, så har jo det allerede vært et stort system som har jobbet mange timer før vi kommer på jobb. Og vi helt avhengig av at andre gjør sin jobb for at vi skal komme oss av gårde da.
Today, Johan and his crew are going to fly a long intelligence-gathering mission in the Barents Sea.
Så samles vi alle I flyet og tar en siste brief før vi tar av, hvor vi går gjennom toktet før vi liner opp på rullebanen og kommer oss av gårde for å gjøre jobben.
The aim of the mission is to find Russian submarines in order to map their movements and their identity.
Ja, vi har jo veldig bra oversikt over marinedelen som holder til I de områdene hvor vi opererer. Det jo det som jobben vår å vite. Å kjenne igjen båter både med navn og hvilken type det båt og sånt. Det jo en del av den utdanningen som du har. Jeg har jo veldig respekt for mine russiske kolleger, akkurat som jeg går ut ifra at de har respekt for meg som en profesjonell som gjør min jobb. Så de også profesjonelle I sin jobb, og sånn sett det jo egentlig veldig positivt for oss at de ute og seiler og får den treningen de skal, for hvis det noe de fleste enige om, så det at å ha et en kompetent nabo bedre enn å ha en nabo som dårlig trent, og Det er da du kan få ulykker og misforståelser som kan skje. Så at de får den treningen som de selvfølgelig skal ha, det er jo bare positivt for oss.
The area patrolled by the Orion aircraft is changing rapidly. During the last 40 years, the ice around the North Pole has been melting fast. This is now making it possible to extract large quantities of oil and gas. Petroleum reserves elsewhere in the world are being exhausted, so pressure on the Arctic is increasing.
People must keep in mind that producing oil and natural gas in those regions is extremely difficult. Conditions are terribly harsh. In some cases, they're almost impossible. In cases where it's almost impossible, the cost of producing oil or natural gas escalate dramatically. So yes, there is a prize there to be, I hope, gained by a number of countries that have borders around that region, but it won't be simple, and it will not be fast, and it is likely to be politically messy also.
The military race in the Arctic has started, and once more, soldiers from other NATO countries are taking part in exercises in the Norwegian snow.
I think you're seeing an increased operational tempo of NATO's interest because we see an evolving policy towards the high north. Russians have certainly expressed their strong interest, as well as our Canadian colleagues. They are now providing troops, contingents in both, to look at Arctic operations, search and rescue. So again, I think you're looking not just from the U.S. perspective, but NATO and many of our closest allies are taking a strong posture in the high north.
The melting ice is not just resulting in better access to oil and gas. It can also create new and more efficient transport routes. In the future, it may be possible to transport goods along the Canadian coast through the Northwest Passage and along the coast of northern Russia through the Northeast Passage. By using these new routes, the transport time from Asia to Europe could be reduced by almost 40%. But these new transport routes are also causing conflict. They are one of the reasons why Canada, for example, is now increasing its military activities in the Arctic.
The need to assert our sovereignty and to take action to protect our territorial integrity in the Arctic has never been more urgent.
Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper is ready and clear on the subject.
You either use it or you lose it. Let me be absolutely clear that your new national government is committed to using it.
Canada is staking its claim to the Northwest Passage as being in Canadian territorial waters. But the USA doesn't agree with its neighbour and thinks that the Northwest Passage is in international waters with unrestricted transport for everyone.
The question of the status of the Northwest Passage is an area where we agree to disagree. But at some point there will have to be some clarification and clarity brought to our disagreement on the status of the Northwest Passage.
On the other side of the North Pole, the melting ice is presenting Russia with a security challenge as its entire northern coastal strip is becoming exposed. The Russian Northern Fleet is now undergoing substantial modernization. One of Russia's military commitments involves the modernization of its nuclear submarines, which are able to fire their missiles from concealed positions beneath the surface of the ocean. This is exactly the type of Russian submarine that Johan and his Orion aircraft crew are hunting for today.
Å holde øye med hvor ubåter er, det blir ganske viktig når man tenker på at de største ubåtene har over 200 stridshoder som ganske mange ganger større enn en Hiroshima-bombe. Så i praksis kan en ubåt ta ut 200 byer da. Det ikke noe problem.
After several hours in the air, the Orion aircraft has still not managed to detect any Russian submarines. Suddenly, the Orion sensors register something beneath the surface of the sea. The crew shoot out listening buoys to find out what it might be. After a while, it becomes apparent that the aircraft is flying above a Russian Delta-class submarine. It's over 150 meters long and is equipped with long-range missiles. The submarine remains hidden beneath the Barents Sea, but the crew of the Orion have secured important intelligence data and they return to base. History has shown that military activities in the Arctic are a dangerous balancing act. Norway, Canada and Russia are now increasing their military focus in the area. Does this mean that the Cold War is back?
Det en viktig forskjell på hvordan man tenkte militært om Arktis under den kalde krigen og nå, at under den kalde krigen så var jo poenget rent militært. Det var rent fysisk så Arktis den korteste veien mellom daværende Sovjetunionen og USA. Når man har et militært blikk på nordområdene i dag, det jo ikke disse grunnene, men det mer avledet av at det en sivil, kommersiell interesse for nordområdene, altså ressursene, fisken, transportrutene, slik at det helheten av det som skaper et ønske i alle statene om å følge med på det som skjer, bedre etterretning, mer evne til nærvær, både fredstidsnærvær med altså kystvakt, tjenester, søk og redning, overvåkning, men også evnen til å gjøre sine interesser tydelige dersom man skulle få en mer komplisert situasjon.
I hope we can avoid wars. It's not inconceivable that there will be wars. The Arctic has potential, probably significant potential to produce natural gas and useful and significant quantities of oil also. I think we're all well aware of the fact that the areas up there are disputed between countries, and we're going to have to find some way to settle those land disputes. And I hope that's peaceful, by the way, because there have been resource wars in the past, and I would hope that we can avoid those at our stage of development and civilization today.
Nordområdene, sånn som vi kjenner det i dag, et stabilt område som inneholder mange strategiske verdier. Det i veldig stor forskjell til andre områder i verden hvor man finner strategiske verdier og ressurser. Disse veldig ofte karakterisert med uro, ustabilitet og militær konflikt. Den situasjonen har vi ikke i nordområdene. Derfor det maktbeliggende for oss å opptre på en sånn måte at vi ikke får en slik ustabil situasjon i nord.
In order to show that priority is being placed on the northern areas, the Norwegian armed forces are now transferring their operational leadership from southern Norway to northern Norway. They're also organizing international military exercises close to the Russian border.
Russia has great sensitivity to any NATO exercise along its border. We are in a very hypersensitive time where NATO is exercising near the perceived sphere of influence of Russia. It's absolutely understandable, and I think NATO asked Moscow to be an observer to the High North exercises, not a participant, but an observer, and Moscow flatly rejected that offer, and then in kind held exercises very close to Finland. I think you'll see this tit for tat. I think it's, again, they're showing each other their interest. They're showing each other their response to an evolving policy. But again, what's so critical is to maintain dialogue.
There is a range of steps we may take to avoid at least fueling of the suspicious attitudes prevailing on the Russian side. So the military activity, which is of the highest concern to Russia, should be definitely transparent, include Russia to the possible extent, of course, and avoid appearing as provocative.
NATO's military leaders are also keen to resolve the race for resources in the Arctic without resorting to military force.
We don't want to return to the Cold War atmosphere. We want to prevent this to happen. So if we want to prevent this to happen, the best and more useful strategy is to engage in a relationship with Russia to make Russia a responsible co-player of the international community. NATO need to be careful not to be an element of rising tension. On the contrary, an element of keeping the low tension and even building greater stability.
In order to maintain stability in the Arctic, the nations are continuing to boost their military activities. This is why there's been an increase in the work of those who have been appointed to keep an eye on resources.
Vi får jo bare mer og mer å gjøre, så jeg ser ikke for meg at arbeidsoppgavene våre blir noe mindre i overskuelig fremtid. Etter hvert som militæraktiviteten øker og fiskeriressursene forsvinner jo for så vidt ikke, altså, i hvert fall ikke hvis vi passer på. Så oppgavene blir større hele tiden, og kommer ikke til å forsvinne, ikke mens min karriere pågår i hvert fall, det helt sikkert.